Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Eric Twiring. I'm the Senior Vice President for the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine, and I want to welcome you to our webinar this evening. I've got a couple of administrative announcements before we get started. This webinar is RACE approved. All of our active diplomates are diplomate candidates and active members of the National Association of Federal Veterinarians, the American Association of Food Safety and Public Health Veterinarians, and the U.S. Animal Health Association will receive CE certificates for their participation tonight, as long as they stay 50 minutes. That is a RACE requirement. You must participate for a minimum of 50 minutes to earn a 1-hour CE certificate. There will be a question and answer period after our presenter is done. If you would like to ask a question about the presentation, please enter your question in the question and answer feature of Zoom, and we will address the questions at the end of the presentation. This presentation will be recorded, and we will post the video to the ACVPM YouTube page in about a week to 10 days. With the holidays, it'll probably be closer to 10 days. One other aspect of the CE certificates, same as the video, with the holidays, it may take a little bit longer to get CE certificates out, so 10 days is more likely than the usual 7 days. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our chair of the ACV Continuing Education Committee, Dr. Suzanne Thomasy.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and especially on this holiday weekend or week. I'd like to welcome Dr. Kimberly Woodruff as our speaker tonight. Dr. Woodruff is a veterinary epidemiologist at Mississippi State University, where she is the director of the Shelter Medicine Program and co-course leader for the Population Medicine Rotation. She's been a diplomate of the ACVPM since 2016 and a diplomate of the epidemiology specialty since 2017. And again, welcome and thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you, everybody. I can't see you, but thank you for being here and seeing me, I guess. Tonight, we're going to talk about a few diagnostic testing issues. So let's start with a scenario. All right, so you are a veterinarian. Well, you're all veterinarians, but you're in general practice somewhere, and you have a 10-year-old client that brings you her 6-month-old kitten that she just adopted from the shelter. And she's very excited about her new kitten. You perform a physical, you don't find any problems, so the cat is apparently healthy. But you know that the cat wasn't tested for FELV or FIV at the shelter, and so you talk to your little client and her family, and you talk them into testing her for FELV and FIV, and the test comes back positive. So this is an apparently healthy cat and a very excited 10-year-old girl, and now what do you do? And what do you recommend to your clients? And do you fault the shelter for putting you in this position? Do you fault the shelter for not testing all of their cats? So we have countless diagnostic tests, right? We have, well, FELV and FIV tests. You do physical exams, and that's a diagnostic test. We have radiology, all sorts of serum chemistry, more tests for blood and saliva and bodily fluids than I can imagine. The list of diagnostic tests goes on and on and on. But the only thing I can tell you for certain for diagnostic testing is that every time you make a diagnostic test, it's either going to be right or wrong. And there are consequences of incorrect tests. So an animal may be inappropriately euthanized or culled or spend extra time in a shelter because they're now less adoptable because you've classified them as with positive disease. You may put a positive animal that test negative back into population, and so you're spreading disease. You may delay treatment in an animal that needs treatment, or you may use resources on an animal that doesn't need treatment, and you may misclassify a population. All of those are costly mistakes. So you've tested this cat. She is testing FELV positive. Your results are back. What else do you need? You need a little bit of clinical judgment about the pre-test probability for this cat, right? You need to know what her probability of testing positive for this disease was before you ever ran the test. And you need to know a little bit about diagnostic test performance. So we're going to hopefully accomplish both of those things tonight. So Pretest probability is what is the probability that the animal that you're looking at or the herd that you're working with, what's the probability that they have the disease? And you need a lot more than a diagnostic test to think about that. You need a history of the case of the animal or a history of the herd. You can look at the clinical signs in front of you, although this cat that we're talking about doesn't have any. You might look at the results of your physical exam, and you might go to the literature and look for prevalence estimates. The other thing to note is that the pretest probability is specific to the animal that you're looking at. And so while the FELV prevalence in the cat population is pretty low, some of the history for this cat might tell you a little bit more about what her specific pretest probability is. For example, if she came from a healthy litter and her litter mates are happy and healthy, then that probably would say that she's probably healthy too. But if the little girl tells you that she had some litter mates that died or were sick, or that she's been sick, then that might make you more likely to believe a positive test in this case. All right, so everybody that has anything to do with epidemiology is familiar with the 2x2 table. I'm pretty sure that most of epidemiology is based on a 2x2 table. So I just wanted to put it back up there and remind you that we classify diseased animals and non-diseased animals always at the top, and then test for our purposes, the test results to the side, to the left-hand side, I think, of your screen. Animals can test true positive, or they can test false positive. They can test false negative, or they can test true negative. And so those are the populations of animals that are going to tell us what we need to know about this diagnostic test performance. When we talk about diagnostic test performance, most often we talk about sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity, both of these are conditional probabilities, by the way, and the condition of sensitivity is that the animals have the disease. So sensitivity is a probability for an animal to test positive given that they have the disease. And the way that you calculate that is looking at your true positives, assuming that you're omnipotent and you know that they're true positive versus false positives. Looking at your true positives divided by all of your animals that are diseased, so your true positives and your false negatives. Specificity, the condition for specificity is that the animals don't have the disease. So it's the probability for an animal to test negative given that they don't have the disease. We're only worried about animals that don't have the disease. So we look at true negatives and we divide that by the total population of animals without the disease. That's the true negatives and the false positives. Okay, so just to keep it simple, we're going to look at a population of 1,000 animals. And we're going to say that we've run some diagnostic tests. 80% of them have been classified as diseased, and 800 of them have been classified as not diseased. So because we know everything, we know that 20 of those animals were diseased and they didn't get caught by the test. And we know that 100 animals that we tested were diseased. No, I'm sorry, were not diseased, and they did get caught by the test. So they are falsely positive. So our sensitivity, remember, we're dealing with the animals that are diseased. We will look at the number of animals that tested positive correctly, 80 animals, over the total number of diseased animals, in this case 100. And so for this particular test, our sensitivity is 80%. Our specificity is the number of animals that tested negative that don't have the disease. So they correctly tested negative. For this test, it's 800 animals out of a total of 900 animals that didn't have the test. And so our specificity for this particular test is 89%. But it's really tempting to think about sensitivity and specificity, and that's really most commonly what people talk about, but we need to add a new level to that. And the thing that we really need to be thinking about is the positive and negative predictive value of the tests that we use. So what's the probability that the test is actually reflecting the true disease status of the animal in question? The predictive values, which we are going to calculate, deal with the animals that tested positive or the animals that tested negative. And that's regardless, it's not conditional on their disease state. True positives are the animals that were correctly tested positive, divided by the total number of animals that tested positive. So those that tested positive that do have the disease, and those that tested positive that don't have the disease or are false positives. You can see from the formula that unlike sensitivity and specificity are direct results of our test results and what we know about the testing. Positive and negative predictive value, and this is really important, you'll see in a little while, I hope. Positive and negative predictive value are functions of sensitivity and specificity, and the key word here is the prevalence of the disease in the population that we're dealing with, or our pretest probability. Negative predictive value is the number of animals that tested correctly negative, they're true negative, divided by all of the animals that tested negative. So those that were true negatives and those that were false negatives. I won't read you the equation that it's at the bottom, but like positive predictive value, it's also a function of sensitivity, specificity, and prevalence of disease. Okay, so because I want to prove to you that prevalence of disease impacts the positive predictive value, we're going to look at the same test that we just used with 80% sensitivity and 89% specificity. But we're going to look at two different prevalences in a population of animals. So let's take our animals, our population of 1,000 animals, and we're going to assume a 1% prevalence here. And so we know that 1% of 1,000 is 10. So 10 of those animals have the disease. We're all knowing, and so we know that in that population, there are 10 animals that have the disease, which means there's 990 animals that don't have the disease. With a test that has a sensitivity of 80%, we're going to catch 8 of those 10 animals, and we're going to miss 2 of them. With a test that has a specificity of 89%, we're going to correctly identify 881 as free of disease, but we're going to identify 109 as positive that don't actually have the disease. So we're going to have 109 false positives. If we want to figure out the positive predictive value for this test in a population with a 1% prevalence, it's going to be the number of correctly identified diseased animals divided by the total number of positive tests. So 8 that were correctly identified, but we had 117 positive tests. So that's a 6% predictive value. So what that means is there's a 6% chance that that animal has the disease, which is not very much in a very low prevalence. So you might not believe a positive test when the prevalence is this low. All right, let's look at the negative predictive value for a prevalence of 1%. We're going to have 881 animals that were correctly identified as test negative, and only 2 of them were tested negative that were actually positive. And so 881 correct tests divided by the total number of negative tests gives us a 99.7% negative predictive value. And that's pretty good. That's really good, actually. So in a population where the prevalence is low, such as this, you can pretty well believe a test with a negative predictive value that high. All right, let's look at a different population. So we're looking at a population now of 1,000 animals. They have a 15% prevalence. And so 150 animals are diseased within our population. With 80% sensitivity, we catch 120 of that. And we miss 30 sick animals that are still in our population. With 89% specificity, we correctly identify 757 animals as healthy, and we identify 93 as sick that are really healthy. So 93 false positives. So for our positive predictive value, we have 120 correctly identified positive tests over 213 total positive tests, which is a 56% predictive value, positive predictive value. So still not great, but a little bit higher. At least now we're right over half of the time. And our negative predictive value is 757, the number of negative correct tests divided by the total number of negative tests. And that gives us a 96.1% negative predictive value. And so you can see that our negative predictive value went down a little bit. So between the two populations with a very, very low prevalence, we have a very low positive predictive value. Probably wouldn't even believe that. With a 15% prevalence, it would raise your suspicions a little bit, all the way to 56%, but you still might want to do some follow-up testing or some other testing strategies that we'll talk about. But the negative predictive value for both of those, it's pretty believable. Okay, so let's go back to our scenario. We have a cat. We have a very happy 10-year-old girl and a cat that has a 3% chance of having this disease because we know, because we looked in the literature, that the prevalence of FELV in healthy, that's the key word, we're looking at healthy cats here, is 3%. And so we run a test, and we know that test is 93% sensitive and 96.5% specific. And so now we have this handy dandy little spreadsheet that was created by somebody much smarter than I am. And you can see that when you plug in our sensitivity and specificity, and we can look at the pretest probability. These are varying levels of prevalence within our population, from 1%, actually from 0 to 1%, all the way up to 10%. So none of this is very high prevalence at all, but we're dealing with a 0.03. That's the 3% prevalence of FELV in the cat population. So our positive predictive value is 45.1%. And our negative predictive value is 99.8%. So that tells you can believe a negative test, but a positive test, it's only going to be right 45% of the time. There's a 45% chance that that cat has the disease. You can look at that in graph form too. So we've graphed what you just looked at. If you look at, we're down here at the 0.03, the 3% pretest probability of disease. So a negative test is pretty believable. You can believe that about 100% of the time. But a positive test is not very believable. And if you look at the 3%, then it coordinates to what we just looked at in the graph, about 45%. All right, so that means that more than half of the cats that we test, that test positive, probably don't even have the disease. So now we have to figure out where our cat falls into that. What if we had the same test, but a higher pretest probability? This is, I made this, well, I didn't make this up, but this is not dealing with our cat. This is just assuming that some illness was more prevalent in a population. So now the pretest probability is from 10% all the way to 100%. So you can still see that it depends on the prevalence in the population about how much of that you can believe, whether you can believe a negative test or whether you can believe a positive test. Both tests will make mistakes. It's just a matter of knowing what's the likelihood that they're making those mistakes. All right, so we come up with a great idea that we don't believe this first test. We are a little bit more sure. We've gone from thinking there's a 3% chance that this cat has FELV to now thinking that there's a 45% chance that this cat has FELV. So you come up with a great idea of backing it up with another test. All right, you have just decided to perform serial testing. Congratulations. Serial testing or sequential testing is when two or more tests are performed, well, sequentially, or in serial, I guess, if you want to use the definition in the name. Only animals that test positive on the first test are tested again, and only animals that test positive on both tests are considered positive. So in a sense, the animal has to prove that it has the disease. There's a spinning top on here because I want you to remember that this type of testing rules in a disease. So we have a higher specificity, a positive rules in the test. So that's the spin acronym, for lack of a better word. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is something that you use when a false positive is more costly than a false negative. And that's the scenario that we're in right now, right? We're having a life and death conversation with this family. A false positive for this kitten could be deadly. So what does that mean for test performance? So we decrease our sensitivity, we get more false negatives. However, we have fewer false positives. And so we've got an increased specificity. We decrease the predictive value of a negative test, but we increase the predictive value of a positive test. So if we get a positive test, because this animal has proven that it's positive on 2 tests, we're more likely to believe it. All right, so let's run an FELV PCR. So this is that same spreadsheet. Now we have a 97% sensitivity and a 97.5% specificity. We're still dealing with 3% prevalence in the population. But now we have a 99.9% negative predictive value. We can still believe a negative test, but we have an increased positive predictive value. We're at 54.5% now for this test alone. If we were only to run a PCR without any other test, we could believe it that if this cat was positive, that there's a 54.5% chance that this cat has FELV. And there's your graph. So it corresponds very well to the spreadsheet that I just showed you. All right, so let's perform some serial testing. This is our first test. This is the one we just ran. We have in a population of 10,000 cats. We know from the literature that the prevalence is about 3%. So 30 cats and 10,000 cats are going to be positive for disease. So that means that 970 of those cats don't have that disease. With a sensitivity of 93%, we're going to correctly identify 28 of those 30 cats, and we're going to miss 2. Sorry. With a specificity of 96.5, we're going to correctly identify 936 that don't have the disease. They're off the hook. They don't have the disease, but we're going to call 34 of them positive that shouldn't be called positive. All right, so we filled out our table now based on some math. All right, so here's the thing. What happens to these cats? So we have 2 that are in the population that are diseased, but they've tested negative, and we have 34 that we have said are positive for FELV that are not. Now you might think, well, there's 2 that are in the population, but that's better than there were going to be 30 in the population. We tested and we got all but 2 of them out there. And so really the more costly mistake for this disease is if you're an animal and you're healthy, but you test positive for this disease, it becomes a life and death situation. A lot of shelters will euthanize based on this. They may be held in the shelter longer. They may put them in a room with FELV or FIV positive cats, and so then they're sure to get the disease. And so, so this is a pretty costly mistake for this cat. And for our cat that we're talking about, it's a very costly mistake. And for our 10-year-old, it's a very costly mistake. All right, so we're gonna run test 2. For the follow-up test in a serial testing, you're only concerned with the animals that tested negative. So our positive predictive value for these animals is 45% with a prevalence of 3%. Our negative predictive value is 99.7. We're not concerned with these 938 animals. They are, for our practical purposes at this point, they're gone. They're free. 2 of those animals shouldn't be, but they're free anyway. So we're concerned with this population, these 62 animals. All right, so for our next test, we only test the animals that tested positive. We use 28 because from the first test, we know that 28 animals have the disease, and so we expect that they will test positive again. But we know that they're in the diseased category because we are omnipotent and all-knowing. And so if 28 have the disease, 34 do not have the disease. We have a 97% sensitive test now and a 97.5% specific test. So 27 are correctly identified as diseased. 33 are correctly identified as not diseased. So we've dropped 1, right? We had 28 that were diseased before, but because 1 tested false negative, we've cleared that animal because they have to test both. They have to test positive on both tests. So, but we've also we've also decreased by a lot the number of false positives that we had, right? So now there's only 1 cat out there that has a life and death decision based on this test. Or that incorrectly has a life and death decision, I guess. Okay, so these are our 2 tests compared. This is our 62, and then we tested those 62. Now we need to figure out the net sensitivity and the net specificity for the combination of these 2 tests. So you can't look at the sensitivity and specificity of them individually, because now we have used them as 1 diagnostic test. 2 tests have become 1. So we know that there are 30 cats that were in this population that were diseased. And so that's our denominator that we're working with. Because they have to prove themselves on both tests to be positive, 27 of those cats we now consider to be positive instead of the 28 that we started with. 27 are positive. And so we divide that by 30 and we get a 90% net sensitivity for these 2 tests. The other way you can do that is multiplying the sensitivities of the two tests. So our first one was 0.93, our second one is 0.97, and that also gives us a 90% sensitivity. For specificity, any animal that tested negative on either test, we're going to assume is negative. And so that's 936 from the first test plus 33 from the second test. And we divide that by the total number of animals we know to be negative, 970. And so we get a 99.8% net specificity. So our net sensitivity went down, but our net specificity went up. And in this case, that's what we want, right? Because we don't want to call any cat positive. The positive is the false positive is a costly mistake. We don't want 34 of these cats to be put to sleep or to spend a longer time in shelters or to undergo unnecessary treatment because we called them positive. And so we have given up sensitivity in favor of specificity. And now there's only one cat that's having some outcome that it doesn't need because of our testing. All right, so we're not going to figure this out tonight because it depends on the shelter and it depends on the a lot of what's going on with the cat in front of you, but it kind of makes you think twice about whether or not you should hold that shelter accountable for not testing their healthy cats, right? It's not straightforward. They're likely to miss some, but they're very, very likely to have some that are positive. All right, so we actually did a FELV and FIV prevalence study here at Mississippi State. Actually, our resident has worked on this. We tested 184 cats in surrounding shelters in Mississippi, and 3 of those cats were positive for FELV, and 6 of those cats were positive for FIV, and none of them actually had the concurrent infection. So those are 9 different cats. And then what we found out, when you take into account test performance, and so you use apparent prevalence to calculate true prevalent estimates, is that both of those gave us negative numbers, which really is consistent with the fact that maybe that's not in the population at all. And these confidence intervals here, if you can see those, the confidence intervals are almost, the high end of the confidence interval is almost 1. And so really a positive test may be less accurate than we thought, because we just said that we couldn't believe a positive test, or we would have trouble believing a positive test for a cat in a situation where there's a 3% prevalence. And what our study shows is that there may only be about a 1% prevalence. So you may have less reason to believe a positive test. It may not be there at all. All right, a second way for a second testing strategy is parallel testing. And this is where you can conduct multiple tests, usually simultaneously, not always, but the catch is that they're positive if they're positive on any of the tests. And so an animal has to prove 2 times that it's healthy. And we use this to rule out a disease. So this is snout, that's why there's big. So a sensitive test, you can believe the negative and it rules out a disease. And we use this when a false negative is more costly than a false positive. We use it when the disease is prevalent, when we're expecting a positive, and then when we're surprised to get a negative. Those would be the situations when you might use parallel testing, because it's going to increase your sensitivity, so you're going to get fewer false negatives. It's going to decrease your specificity, so you may have some false positives, but you won't have as many. And I'm sorry, you're going to have more false positives. It will increase your predictive value of a negative test, and it will decrease the predictive value of a positive test. So this is when a false negative is costly in a population. Okay, so we're going to run 2 tests in serial now. Our first test is a test that's 80% sensitive and 60% specific. In our same population of, well, in a population of 1,000 animals, we're going to assume a prevalence of 90%. So that would mean 900 of these animals have the disease. So remember, this is a testing strategy you can use in high prevalence situations. And so that's what we have, 90% prevalence. With a sensitivity of 80%, we're going to capture 720 of those animals and correctly identify them as diseased. With a specificity of 60%, we're only going to correctly identify 60 as having the disease. We're going to misclassify 40% of those as positive when they're not positive. All right, so this is our test 2. So we choose a test with a higher sensitivity and a higher specificity. Now we're at 90% for both of them. So we're going to catch 90% of our 900 diseased animals, so 810 animals. And we're going to correctly identify 90 of the 100 that are healthy. All right, so these are our tests side by side for comparison. And remember that if they test positive on either one of these tests, they don't have to test positive on negative on both of them. If they test positive on either one, we're going to consider them positive for the disease. So this is a little bit more complicated. Step 1, we know that some of these animals that tested positive and are diseased are going to be the same animals, and we don't want to count them twice. So we have to figure out what the overlap is. So there were 720 animals that tested positive on our first test, and our second test had a sensitivity of 90%. So we can assume, there's a lot of assuming here, I guess, we can assume that 90% of those animals would have tested positive on our second test. So 720 times 90% is 648. So of the 810 on our second test that tested correctly positive, we can assume that 648 of those also tested positive on the first test. So now we have to figure out the difference. 720 minus 648 is 72. So there's 72 animals that got caught on the first test that didn't test positive on the second test. 810 minus 648 is 162. So there's 162 animals that tested positive on our second test with higher sensitivity, but didn't test positive on our first test. So if we add all of those up, the 648 that are overlap plus the 72 from the first test plus the 162 from the second test, we get 882 animals total that tested positive. We divide that by 900, which is what we know of the prevalence in this population, and that gives us a net sensitivity of 98%. Net specificity, remember if they tested negative on either one of these, if they tested positive on either one of these, then they're positive. 60% of those we can assume would have been correctly identified. 90% of the 60 would have been correctly identified on the second test. So that's 54, and 54 divided by 100 is 54%. So net specificity of 54%. So our sensitivity went up, our specificity went down. All right, so what's the take-home message from everything we just talked about? I hope I've encouraged you to quit only thinking about sensitivity and specificity and to think more in terms of predictive value. What do you know about the patient that's in front of you or about the herd that's in front of you? Predictive value is a function of the test performance and the prevalence of the disease or the pretest probability. You can use sensitive tests and you can use sensitive tests to minimize false negatives and specific tests to minimize false positives. But remember to always think about that in terms of prevalence in your population, because what you want to be able to interpret correctly is a predictive value of those tests. Serial testing increases the specificity, but it decreases the sensitivity. I'm sorry, that's supposed to be parallel testing. I'm sorry, serial testing increases positive predictive value and decreases negative predictive value. And parallel testing increases sensitivity, but decreases specificity, while it increases negative predictive value and decreases positive predictive value. Wow, that got me all tongue-tied. Sorry about that. Okay, one last thing that we want to talk about here is when you're working on all of this, but you're at a herd level, how do you set up testing strategies to determine the disease status of your herd? Herd level sensitivity is that the probability that a herd that has the disease will be correctly classified as having the disease. And herd level specificity is that the probability that a herd that doesn't have the disease, that's truly free of the disease, will be correctly classified as not having the disease. We've already talked about how test predictive value and negative predictive value are functions of sensitivity and specificity and disease prevalence. But in herd testing, in herd testing, there's even more. We're sampling to detect the disease. And so in addition to sensitivity, specificity, and prevalence, we also need to know the number of reactors that will classify that herd as positive. We need to know the size of the herd that we're dealing with, and we need to know the number of animals that we want to test. All right. In a larger sample size, so if we're testing more members of the herd or the population, we have an increased herd sensitivity because we're more likely to find that positive animal. However, if we have a larger sample size, we're going to decrease the herd specificity, right? Because the more animals we test, the more likely we are to have that false positive. So this is an example of a test with 95% sensitivity, 97% sensitivity, specificity. We have a population of 400 animals, and we know that the prevalence of disease within this herd or this population is 10%. And so what you can see is that the sensitivity is very high here, but the specificity gets very low very quickly because you're dealing with a whole population of animals, and the minute you classify any animal as diseased, you've classified that whole herd as diseased. So the more animals you test, the more likely you are to do that. But you have a better herd sensitivity because you're also more likely to find the true positive animal. Herd level positive predictive value is a probability that a herd that's classified as diseased truly has the disease. So it's the probability that when we say, yep, this herd has a disease, that it's really there. And the herd level negative predictive value is the probability that the herd doesn't have the disease. All right, so this is the same example looking at positive and negative predictive value. So 95% sensitivity, 97% specificity, a population of 400 animals, and a 10% disease prevalence within those animals. You can see our same sample, our same herd sensitivity and specificity over here. But when you're looking at predictive value, you can see that the predictive value, positive predictive value for this is very, very low. And the negative predictive value is very high. So if you get negative tests, you can believe it. But as soon as you get a positive test in an individual, that entire herd is classified. And so you have to be really careful with the interpreting a positive test. All right, this has to do with apparent prevalence, herd apparent prevalence, and herd true prevalence. And you can see that the more animals you test, it's the same story. The more animals you test, the more likely you are to call that herd disease, even though that prevalence may be lower. So when multiple animals are being tested to determine a herd's infectious status, you really want the specificity to be as high as possible. So you want to, your costly mistake here is false positives. So that that classifies a whole herd as TB positive or whatever you're dealing with, but that's a very costly mistake. And so you want to test in a way that minimizes that probability. The problem with increasing your specificity, so finding a test that has a higher specificity, or testing in series, serial testing, which we just found out increases our specificity, right? So if we increase our specificity, what that does is decrease our sensitivity. So we have to figure out how to get around that. And the way that we do that is, to test more animals, and that accounts for our decreased sensitivity. All right, so now we have either found a test with a 99% specificity, or we've tested in series. So now we have a lower sensitivity and a higher specificity, and we have to test more animals because our sensitivity is lower. But you can see from the charts that now our positive and negative predictive values are very high. So we test more animals, but we can trust our test a whole lot better. So there's some examples of that. Bovine tuberculosis is a really good example of why this is important, because we test, well, I don't, but y'all do. Some people test a lot of cows and cattle for tuberculosis. And so with testing that many cattle, you're going to find some that are false positive. And so the minute you do that, you have a whole herd of cattle that is classified as TB positive. And so the way we get around that is to then test in series. The same thing with BSE. This is a press release about bovine spongiform encephalopathy, that this massive testing program also there were some consequences of a lot of false positives. And so they got around that by doing serial testing. And so that's just a couple of real world scenarios where you might use serial testing. Okay, I think that that's about all I have. We have a few minutes for questions, I believe.
Okay, I want to thank you, Dr. Woodruff. Great presentation. If anybody has questions, we do have one question in the
Yes.
Q&A feature, but if anybody else has questions, please go ahead and enter them now. The question is, what was the difference between serial and parallel testing? As in, is serial testing using multiple different blood samples pulled at different times, and parallel is the same blood sample used for both tests?
Let's go back. So it doesn't have to do, it has more to do with which population you're testing. Sorry, I'm trying to get back to the slides. So I have a lot of slides, by the way. All right. Serial testing is 2 or more tests that are conducted one after the other. So you test a group of animals, and some of those animals are positive, and then you only test the positive animals again. And so when we filled out this 2x2 table, remember that I said that there were 62 that tested positive, and those are the only ones that we're interested in. So the catch for serial testing is that to be considered positive for the disease, they have to test positive on the first test. Then we have to test them again, and they have to test negative. I mean, they have to test positive on the second test. So they have to have at least two positive tests before we consider them disease positive. And the other thing is, you don't just rerun the same test, right? This is you run, so when we did it, our example was that we ran a SNAP test for FELV, and then we chose a test with different specs, right? Different test performance. And we ran a totally different kind of test and made that animal prove to us that it was positive. So serial testing, 2 different tests, and they have to be positive for both of them. And you're only worried about the ones that test positive on that first test. All right, now we'll wade through the slides to the parallel testing. Parallel testing is still 2 tests, but if they test positive on either test, they're considered positive. And so one way to think about that is that for parallel testing, you're worried about you are focusing in on these test negatives from that first test, because if they test positive on the first test, they're positive. You don't actually need to run a second test on them because they'd be positive even if they tested negative on that. You would call them positive. But you're concerned with this population of animals that tested negative. And so you test them again and with a different test. And if they test positive on that test, even if they tested negative on the first one, they're still considered positive for the disease.
I'm going to go ahead, and I think you may have answered Dr. Gwynn's message. I'm going to activate Dr. Gwynn's microphone. If you can just confirm that your question was answered.
Thinking about the cat, for example, why would you even run the first test? Unless the first test costs a lot less than the second test?
Yeah, so that would be a really good reason to run the first test. So this is a really low prevalence of disease, right? We don't expect this cat is going to be positive. And so one reason that we might choose to run a test first is that it's less invasive or it's less costly. We're dealing with shelters that have, a lot of things that need their resources. And so it would not be feasible for them to just decide to run a PCR on every cat for such a low prevalence of disease.
Right. So for parallel testing, you're really looking for a negative. So you're
confirming the negatives for parallel testing.
Really choose parallel testing for the cat in question.
Why? I'm sorry. Why did we or why didn't we?
No, you really wouldn't.
No. because you want, for that one, remember, we don't want to have a false positive. And so we want that cat to have to prove to us that she's positive. So in the serial testing, she proves that she's positive by testing positive on both tests. In parallel testing, she doesn't have to prove that she's positive. She has to prove that she's negative. If she tests positive in that first test, we're going to run another one. And if she tests negative, we'll say, oh, good, she's negative. I'm sorry, if she tests negative, we're going to run another one. And if she tests positive on that one, she's positive for both of them. Right? If they test positive on either
of a disease that you commonly parallel test with?
Well, I was actually talking to somebody about that today. And so this person is a cattle veterinarian, but he suggested that pregnancy, diagnosis in a herd is a really one that you might run a parallel test. So you're standing there in pregnancy testing a line of cattle or dairy cows or whatever. You can do an ultrasound and you find that the ultrasound shows that she's not pregnant, but you don't believe that because maybe this is a well-managed herd and she should be pregnant. And so while you're there, you just go ahead and put on a sleeve and test her yourself. And so she tested negative on the first test, but you wanted to back that up. And if she tests negative on the second one, you'll say, yeah, I guess she really is negative. But if she tests positive on the first one, on the second one, which is your arm, then you'll say, she is actually positive.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to try to lump some of these questions together. There's several questions with regard to parallel testing. First one, do you always retest the full group for parallel testing, or do you choose the subset of negatives more commonly?
You can choose a subset of negatives because all they have to do for parallel testing is test positive on one test. So those that have tested positive on your test number one, you're going to call them positive even if they test negative on that second test.
I think that's the last one with regard to just parallel testing. Then there's some questions with regard to test selection. A question is, how do you make the determination of when to do a serial versus parallel testing? Is there any specific criteria you use?
Yeah, let's go back to, I'm now finding the fault in having so many different slides. Okay, serial testing. That decreases our sensitivity, right? So we get more false negatives, but it increases our specificity. So we get fewer false positives. It increases our predictive value of a positive test. So in the case of our cat, it's really important to us that we don't have a false positive. So we want something that is going to increase our specificity. So we choose a serial test because it takes a whole lot more for her to be called positive than it would on a parallel test. For a parallel test, it increases the sensitivity because they have 2 shots to be negative. So you get fewer false negatives, right? They can be negative. All right, there we go. So increased sensitivity, fewer false negatives because they have 2 chances to be positive. And all they have to do is be positive for one of them.
Do you have a recommendation to find the best resource for prevalence of any particular disease in your area?
Yeah, Google. No, I'm just kidding.
For example, vesicular stomatitis, heartworm disease, etc.
I don't know the answer to that. I think that there's probably, there may be state reporting, but I don't know the answer for specific areas about prevalence of disease. You can go to the literature and do general lit searches, but I don't know of anywhere that's like, anywhere in Mississippi that's responsible for reporting the prevalence of heartworm disease and things like that. Your best chance is peer-reviewed articles.
And that kind of goes along with a question. An individual says, I feel the biggest challenge is that we really don't have prevalence data for many things, especially in small animal medicine. Do you have any thoughts on how best to proceed without this data?
Yes. Plug here for keeping data. Yeah, it's why we encourage shelters and producers and everybody to keep the data because it's hard to make these decisions without knowing what's out there. And so my my advice or whatever, or the question was, do I have any advice or thoughts on this? And my advice is to keep really good records and to encourage the clients that you work with to keep good records.
The individual that made that comment provided in the question and answer section that a website has some prevalence data that is reasonable for heartworm. I will include that in the chat.
Great.
Just so everybody can see it. And then a couple more questions. Using your kitten example, well, let me just see if Dr. Rude would ask this question. Let me go ahead and activate his microphone. Dr. Rude, you had a question with regard to the kitten example?
Yeah, so I appreciate this great presentation, Dr. Woodruff, but if you're looking at repeating could you wait some period of time between this, in your example, the kitten, 10-year-old client, et cetera, and let's say 3 weeks, come back in 3 weeks, we're going to test with the same. And so does that make any mathematical sense? And then, because I noticed in both your serial and your parallel, you changed tests, and so your sensitivity and specificity, of course, changed.
Right.
But in the kitten example, it's really common in clinics to say, you know what, I don't believe this. It's a clinically healthy cat. You know, it doesn't come from the right background, et cetera, et cetera. So come on back when you come in for boosters or whatever. You know, let's retest. Does that make mathematical sense? Because so we didn't change the test sensitivity and specificity.
So the problem with that is that it may be positive because it's cross-reacting with something. And so if you run the same test, you run the risk of having the same type of error. So it's better.
Right.
It's better for everybody.
Right.
I think a better situation if you pick a different test the next time you run that test.
But that's commonly done with some diseases in herd medicine, for example, Yonis and milk ELISA tests, because they're just so convenient. So you really don't change. And in that scenario, you set up your case definitions different. You know, any positive is positive. Yeah. So appreciate this. This is great.
Thank you.
A couple more questions. And this, I believe, is at the very start of the presentation. The math for net sensitivity and specificity, the SN1, SN2 didn't come out right.
I was looking at the serial testing one. When I used the sensitivity and specificity you had up in the corners and multiplied it out, it didn't come out to what you had for the net sensitivity and specificity ones.
So,
but I didn't have time to write down the whole formula, just the sensitivity
we'll
1 times sensitivity 2.
We didn't. So
yeah,
for the serial testing, I didn't give you a formula. Is this the slide that you're talking about?
Yeah, because I did the 80 times 90, which didn't work.
Yeah, you can't do that for that was for serial testing, not parallel testing.
Ah, okay. So this wasn't the serial.
This is parallel testing where we run them both at the same time.
That would be why. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's good because I thought I did something wrong.
Okay, we're going to go with one more question, just to clarify. For an individual, serial testing helps with reducing false positive results, and parallel helps with reducing false negatives. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes. So here's parallel testing, and we get fewer false negatives. And so for serial testing, we get fewer false positives. Remember, because for serial testing, they have to prove that they're right, that they're positive 2 times. For parallel testing, they have to prove that they're negative 2 times.
Okay, we're approaching our hour, and I want to thank you, Dr. Woodruff, for a very informative presentation. I realized how much I have forgotten over the years, but very informative, and I know we have a lot of ACDPM candidates on the presentation, and I'm sure assist them in their studying for the upcoming ACDPM board certification exam in June. Dr. Tomasi, did you have any closing comments?
No, I just want to thank everyone for attending and all the great questions. Thank you, Dr. Woodruff, for that presentation. I agree. It wasn't a great refresher, even for me.
Thanks for
And
having me.
yeah, and I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving this week. And one last plug for admin stuff. We've got our speakers lined up for 2021, but we are always looking for speakers for 2022. So if you have any topics you would like covered, or know any presenters that you would like to hear or would like to do yourself, please send
Hey,
Eric an email.
And I
thank
guess
you.
I should put my email address in the chat. It's admin@acvpm.org. So you want to volunteer, let us know. And again, phone callers, same email address, admin@acvpm.org. So I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and keep a watch on your email for future announcements about CE webinars. Everybody have a great evening. Thank you very much.